Video games are a pretty cool little industry. If you've spent any amount of time invested in the hobby, you've likely seen a landmark title drop, one that changes things from then on and will continue to influence the medium for years to come. And I don't think there's too many people in this audience today that I'll have to convince The Last of Us fits into that category. This thing was a genuine moment in gaming, a time when a hefty percentage of us, fans of opposing genres, characters, archetypes, or peripherals, came together and said, yeah, this is something special. Now, those of you who have watched the channel for a bit probably don't need to be told this, but I tend to have, let's say, eclectic taste in video games. I mean, I'm not some hipster being a contrarian for the mere sake of looking cool, or at least that's what I say publicly. I've just never really enjoyed the type of games that tend to garner big mainstream popularity. I'm sure stuff like Halo, Super Mario, or I don't know, Sonic are great in their own rights. There's just nothing there I personally enjoy. So when Perfect 10 started raining on The Last of Us by the bushel, I'll admit it made me a little less interested. One fateful night a few months after its release though, me and my wife decided to finally give it a shot and see what all the fuss was about, and I'll be damned. For one of the first times I can remember, I finally understood the hype surrounding a modern mainstream video game release. That was a pretty special moment for me, and since I have this YouTube channel specifically for the purposes of discussing my own special moments in gaming, you'd figure the combination was a no-brainer. But by the time I got anywhere good enough at content creation to make something that would accurately get my point across and be entertaining enough for someone to sit through, the game was sort of old hat. So years went by, and eventually a Patreon supporter would ask me to finally buckle down and put some of my thoughts together for a video. Then The Last of Us Remake was announced, so I figured that would be my moment. Of course, thanks to my hectic schedule combined with my terrible habit of getting lost in old PS1 and PS2 era JRPGs for far too long, this video will likely release just long enough after The Last of Us Part 1 that it'll no longer be relevant anyways, but hey, if it was released on time and without any major drama, it just wouldn't be an Avalanche Reviews video, right? Well, the goal here today is to take a look back at a game released 10 years ago and sift through the ashes, as it were. I feel like it's been long enough since The Last of Us release that any hot takes are likely long dead, and any lingering controversy, if there ever was any, has long since dissipated. So what kind of a game was it? Why did it have such a memorable impact on so many of us? And with remakes and remasters currently available to the gaming public, what's the best way to play it? By the way, if you're just looking for coverage of the remake and how it stacks up to other ports and releases, I can understand, by the way. I'll have the chapters labeled accordingly so you can skip straight ahead to that section if you want. So if you guys will join me, I'd like to sit down and explore a game that means a lot to me and hopefully figure out why that is. What's up, guys? I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews.
What's your business here?
Got the day off. Visiting a friend.
All right, move on through. Thanks.
Get out of here! Go! Close it up!
You know how sometimes a game's initial concept can get sort of twisted by the development process, and then the final product ends up nothing like what it was initially supposed to be? Well, that's the exact opposite of what happened here. The Last of Us creative director Neil Druckmann says he came up with the idea in college, and it was supposed to be a mashup of the PS2 game Eco and Night of the Living Dead. He wanted players to take on a role similar to Hartigan from Sin City, charged with looking after a young girl in a zombie apocalypse, and while the overall plot is a little different point by point, I'd say this is one of the few examples of a good conceptual idea surviving video game development. You know guys, normally this would be where I summed up a game's story before going into any criticisms or analysis, but I think given TLU's age and popularity, a little brevity's in order. So how about a very brief summary for those of you who've played it before but maybe haven't touched it in a long time? Oh, and by the way, I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between key moments in the game, which means I will be spoiling them for anyone who hasn't played it yet. And since it would be damn near impossible to break out into any meaningful conversation regarding the story's events while keeping you first-timers in mind, let's just consider everything after this point a spoiler. This is a video game I absolutely recommend you play before I ruin it for you, so pause the video right here and I'll catch up with you guys after you've seen the credits roll.
After all we've been through. Everything that I've done. It can't be for nothing.
The Last of Us puts you in the shoes of Joel, a normal working man just trying to support his preteen daughter Sarah, and the game plops us down in his world the same night it essentially ends. Some form of fungal cordyceps is infecting people at a rapid pace, and those infected become a sort of slave to the will of the fungus, turning them into the kind of zombies that's okay to include in your story long after the point when zombies became overdone in mainstream media. And I think this was a nice little touch, as it's a real or quasi-real phenomenon where cordyceps fungus will infect insects and hijack their bodies, forcing them to expose themselves to predators in order to propagate its own spread. On the night the shit hits the fan, Joel, his daughter, and brother try to get out of the city but run into the business end of that zombie apocalypse. The army appears to be attempting to contain the spread of the phenomenon, and in the process, his daughter Sarah is shot and killed, an event that will, understandably, forever alter Joel as a person.
Listen to me. I know this hurts. You're gonna be okay, baby. Stay with me. I'm gonna pick you up. I know, baby. I know it hurts.
After that absolute nut shot of an opening, the game jumps ahead 20 years, and our protagonist, along with the world he lives in, has become dark and hardened. It seems like most of humanity lives in small quarantine zones, little strips of cities where a strong military force keeps a firm grip on anyone or anything within their walls. Soldiers control where people go and what food they can eat, which sets up fertile ground for Joel's new profession. He and his partner Tess run a smuggling operation that runs the gamut from smuggling things in and out of the quarantine zone to arms trading. The game doesn't come out and say this out loud, instead just hinting at it, but the guy has certainly seen and done some real dirt since the world has ended.
Repay you.
For all those goddamn years I took care of us.
Took care. That's what you call it? I got nothing but nightmares from those years.
After a pretty average day of murdering and gun running, the two are approached by the leader of a resistance movement called the Fireflies. She wants them to smuggle a 14-year-old girl named Ellie out of the city, a task that immediately goes bad, and in the process of escaping the military, the two find out that Ellie here has some form of immunity to the cordyceps infection. According to her, she was bitten months ago and has yet to turn, a process that normally takes days at best. It seems like the Fireflies were dead set on getting Ellie to one of their outposts so that scientists could take a look at what exactly makes her so resistant to the thing that ruined the world. Our girl Tess becomes sort of enamored with the mission, and after getting bit herself, begs Joel to see this deal through to the end. Joel, not exactly thrilled at the concept of taking on another teenage girl, given his track record, begrudgingly agrees, and over the long journey, the two form a very close bond. They survive all kinds of trials and tribulations together, and their newfound quasi-father-daughter relationship is threatened when the two reach their end goal. After handing Ellie over to the Fireflies, Joel finds out that the operation to obtain the info they want will kill her. A casualty the leader of the Fireflies is willing to risk, but Joel, not so much.
I ain't got time for this.
Our guy goes on a straight-up rampage in the facility, grabs Ellie and puts a bullet in the woman running the show, effectively saving the girl he's grown to love, but simultaneously dooming humanity to an eternity of living in fear of turning into fungus-infected monsters. When Ellie finally comes to, Joel lies and says there's actually a lot of people like her, and after the Fireflies experimented on all of them, they were not able to find the information they needed. And the game ends on an especially effective scene where Ellie asks Joel to come clean and tell her what happened back in the hospital. Joel, faced with the option of telling her the truth or continuing the lie, decides on the latter, and boom, roll credits.
Okay.
Now, this was a very brief, very surface-level recap, so it's understandable if some of you are wondering what exactly made this game so damn popular, and I think there are two answers to that question. The first being some world-class writing. The Last of Us, while being relatively simple in structure, is actually quite complex emotionally. It doesn't take shortcuts to audience engagement seen in lesser works. Characters in this game aren't perfect. They don't greet every day with a smile, refusing to let the world get them down. They're complicated and don't easily fit into lazy stereotypes. The game is great about vaguely hinting at the things Joel got up to in the 20 years since his daughter died, and it's very clear about one thing. Joel was not, and arguably is not, a good guy.
Fuck you, man. He told you what you wanted. I ain't telling you shit. That's all right. I believe him.
He's done some incredibly rough shit in order to survive. And some of you may be thinking, well, the world is hardened and Joel just did what he needed to, but things aren't quite so cut and dry. At one point, when the two are caught in a trap set by thieves looking to kill them and jack them for their shit, Joel admits to Ellie that he's been involved in a few of these operations himself.
So, you kill a lot of innocent people? I'll take that as a yes.
Take it however you want.
Joel has killed people to get what he needs, and I get the feeling that some of those situations weren't exactly morally justified, which I think is backed up by the fact that his brother no longer wants anything to do with him because of all the brutality he saw when he was with him. This isn't your typical movie bad person made less so by the injection of a moral good in his life. Even after Joel realizes his love for his new friend, he continues to do terrible things. Really, his actions haven't changed much in the last 20 years. He's just got someone he's doing these things for now, aside from himself. Now, to be very clear, I'm not trying to be overly judgy or philosophical. I'm sure a lot of us would clear out an entire hospital of armed men to save the ones we love, but that doesn't change the fact that it would be something terrible to do. I think that's what makes Joel such a compelling and endearing figure. Sure, he does go through some very gratifying personal growth, but at the end of the day, he's still very much a hardened killer. Before Ellie showed up, he did these terrible things for himself, but now he's got someone to protect, and the act of killing people is a little more morally excusable, but still not something a good person does with such ease. From the day his daughter died to the very last scene in the game, Joel is, for all intents and purposes, a bad person. The game doesn't try to go out of its way to justify or excuse that, it just gives him a new reason to continue being that way. One I think we can all empathize with.
Just give me a couple.
And this goes for nearly everyone in the story. Tess, Bill, Marlene, these are all stone cold killers who would sooner gut you than lend a hand to help, and that sucks. But in their defense, in the world they live in, this is a trait shared by most people who survive longer than a week. Even Ellie doesn't come out of this unscathed. Sure, she was justified in killing her would-be, let's call, attacker towards the end of the game, but at the start she directly causes the death of two people who were just doing their jobs. This is a messy world with dirty characters living in it, and I think it's what makes the story so well written. There is no riding off into the sunset with a clean conscience here. At the end of the story, a hell of a lot of people are left dead, and things have basically been reset to how they were at the start. Everyone's still living in a hellscape where a fungal infection could turn you into the Walking Dead, and people are still just as dangerous as any spore cloud.
Tell them that Ellie is the little girl that broke your fucking finger!
So the question is, what makes this dark story filled with bad people so damn enticing to us regular non-murderers? Well, that's where its second accomplishment comes into play. Voice acting that may very well rival anything ever recorded in the medium before. The Last of Us is an incredibly emotional tale, and it stands to reason Naughty Dog would want the absolute best talents in the industry voicing it, and in my opinion, that is exactly what they got. This cast, even though they've been constantly showered with praise, deserve even more credit for their performances. Don't get me wrong, the writers 100% gave them the words to say, but you've just got to step back in awe at how well those words work their way into the emotion of a scene. Alright, listen, I'm gonna level with you. I'm not the type of person who admits this very easily in a public venue, but there are at the very least 3 scenes in this game that brought genuine, honest-to-goodness tears to my eyes.
It's me.
He tried to...
Oh, baby girl. It's okay. It's okay.
No.
Scenes that very well may have had half the emotional impact if it weren't for the absolute talent behind their delivery. Each and every line in this game is genuine perfection, and it really helps that the voice actors who delivered them were selected specifically to fit the characters in-game as opposed to just picking the most popular person in the industry at the time. Having a voice and personality that fits your on-screen avatar is a big part of giving a believable acting performance, and explains why in The Last of Us, Troy Baker can give an incredibly and authentic Joel, but absolutely fails as James Sunderland in Silent Hill 2.
Eddie, who's that dead guy in the kitchen?
Honestly though, I don't think the why here is all that important, and if I'm being real, I don't know enough about this stuff to fully explain that anyways. I mean, you've heard the terrible job I do with my own voiceovers. Safe to say I have no idea how giving a believable performance really works. The fact of the matter is, these people have given these characters true and honest voices, and above that, they also supplied their bodies. Each of the scenes in the game were acted out and motion captured by the actual voice actors, and a buddy once told me he believes this elevates them to the role of actual honest-to-goodness actors, and I think I agree.
Why are you so scared all of a sudden?
Because I'm a big coward, okay? Now pack up your shit and let's go!
I think what's really important here is the fact that I tell you The Last of Us is easily one of the most emotionally engaging and heart-wrenching stories I've ever experienced. Its characters are relatable, believable, and the relationships that they've built are some of the most solidly realized I've ever come across in the medium. Maybe it's something about me being a guy at my age that gives me a sort of genetic predisposition towards this kind of father-daughter dynamic on screen, or possibly a combination of that and an expert production, but I found myself really wanting to protect Ellie in game, and that makes what happens at the end a little easier to sympathize with. All around, this was just an expertly handled story for me. Each and every character gave thoroughly convincing performances, and the general situation they were in was one that felt fresh despite drawing from a whole lot of overused themes. And you know what? I'm spending all this time trying to think of more objective ways to describe my experience here, but I think that might be the wrong approach. The Last of Us has a story that just flat out touched me. I can't necessarily give you guys concrete examples of the kind of literary structure that may have led to that or what methods its creators may have employed. I can only tell you the effect it all had on me, and it was substantial. Even someone like me, who mostly chases that single-player, story-focused experience, can forget sometimes that this medium is capable of so much more than providing nice visuals and fun gameplay to engage with. It can also put us in fully realized narrative worlds, let us experience things we never could in our real lives, and affect us in ways more passive media like movies or TV shows really can't. I may not be able to fully explain why this damn game had such a lasting impact on me, but I can say I'm supremely happy I took the time that night to sit down and see what all the fuss was about, because in doing so I found one of my absolute favorite stories ever told in a video game. Like I said at the start, I've never really been a guy to lose his mind over popular mainstream releases, but in this one instance, I can say the crowd was most definitely moving in the right direction. If you are somehow hearing these words but have not played this game yet, I cannot possibly overstate how big of a mistake that is. In a medium that is by no means afraid to tell impressively well thought out stories, The Last of Us still stands head and shoulders above most of its competition.
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me. Everyone fucking except for you.
I'm not gonna lie to you guys, it was a little hard to come up with the exact ideas necessary to verbalize why and how this game's story meant so much to me, but luckily we have moved on to an infinitely less complex issue. The Last of Us is a very simple game when you sit down and take a look at it. It's essentially broken down into two delineated gameplay styles. There's your open, exploratory sections where Joel and Ellie can both stroll through some eye-watering post-apocalyptic scenery and engage in some very light problem solving. Mostly this will have you searching the environment for some kind of tool to help you get past a roadblock. For example, ladders or planks of wood to cross gaps, or wooden pallets to help Ellie's not knowing how to swim ass get across a body of water. These parts of the game are the most serene and laid back, as there's almost never a fail state to worry about. You can just stroll around at your own pace and get an eyeful of the world these guys have cooked up for you. There are little off the beaten path areas to be explored, and finding a spot like this almost always guarantees you a little extra loot for your troubles, but overall you'll have very little expected of you in these parts. This is when the game's designers and artists really go all out with the window dressing, and if you're anything like me, these sections will have you wearing out your right thumbstick from constantly looking around trying to take it all in. Moving away from these less stressful areas, we've got the stealth sections. These start off in more closed-off portions of the game, but as you progress, you see more outside locations, which makes for a much more satisfying challenge. To help with the relatively unpredictable nature of infected foes and the long-distance lethality of the human ones, you're given the ability to see through walls and obstructions when holding R1, explained in-game as Joel or Ellie just listening real hard to their surroundings. And I'll admit, this can smell faintly like the kind of dumbing down that a lot of modern games tend to lean towards, but I found this little mechanic is nowhere near as useful as you might think, or at the very least it doesn't have to be. In my experience, you can get through most encounters just taking it slow and keeping your eyes and ears open. Sometimes the game may put you in a situation where that's not possible, and you might need to hit R1 real quick just to make sure the way forward is clear, but you really don't have to use this very much at all, which I think makes it a good inclusion. It's the kind of mechanic that someone who's not super good at the game yet can use to their advantage, but at least in my experience, it's not something the game was built to solely rely on, so a person not looking to use any handicaps can still experience the game the way they want without being forced to use it.
Hey! Take it easy.
There are difficulty settings where you'll be locked out of using the listen skill, which intuitively ups the difficulty, but I kinda like making it more of a personal challenge. Like, sure, it's there if I really need it, but there's a certain amount of satisfaction that comes from clearing a whole building of bad guys without touching R1, even though I know that I can if I need to. Regardless of whether or not you use it though, all of the modern stealth game rules apply here. Good stealth is rewarded, and sneaking up on enemies from behind will give you a chance for a single button takedown, but if things go wrong, and they often do, you'll have enough resources to go guns hot for a bit. This is also one of the very rare situations that you'll see where the stealthy, quiet approach is just as viable and balanced as the loud and action-packed one. I mean, sure, games have been doing the whole approach the experience the way you want thing for eons now, but I often find the balance is a bit off. Titles that allow you to both stealth it up and engage in more out-in-the-open fights often skew way too heavy in the direction of the stealth end of the spectrum, but The Last of Us does a great job of making you feel pretty proficient in both. It's kind of cool. I feel like you can get through this game 100% using no stealth whatsoever, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, completely ghosted. And of course, those two skill sets are going to be a little different, but each of them are perfectly viable. You can pick up melee weapons scattered around the environment, and these will most definitely help when bad guys get too close, but mostly you'll just be shooting at stuff, which is good because man does this game have some surprisingly satisfying gunplay.
Whoa.
It sticks more towards the hyper risk versus reward side of things, meaning sure, sliding out of cover to line up a headshot can net you an easy win, but these people are aiming their guns at you too. You're just about as susceptible to gunfire as any of the foes you come across, and it's really easy to make one mistake and find yourself sporting a few more holes than you woke up with. I'll tell you from experience, there is most definitely a learning curve here. You're going to have to get used to how aiming, moving, and weapon switching works, but it won't be long till you're pulling off some real action movie shit. It's the kind of system you probably won't be able to excel at immediately, but when things start to click, there's really nothing like it. Shooting just feels really satisfying in this game, and enemies react to hits in very visceral ways that let you know these guns are every bit as dangerous as they sound and feel. It's a little hard to put something like this into words because so much of the game's shooting relies on feeling, but the feedback you get from the game for every trigger pull is wildly impactful. I really appreciate when a game makes shooting feel substantial, and The Last of Us is damn near in a league of its own in that sense. It also feels like there's just the right amount of time where you're able to line up shots, but not so much that you feel like Naughty Dog's patronizing you. Sitting too long trying to sight in the perfect headshot will result in you taking a hit first, and enemies will also notice you targeting them and try to move out of the way, something that never fails to throw me off. Each weapon's gonna have fairly realistic downsides like long reload times or ass loads of kick, and these can be mitigated with weapon upgrades, but you can also raw dog it and just use them effectively for the situations they were designed for in real life. For example, the long wait in between shots required for using the bolt-action rifle is almost always balanced out by the distance you're using it at, making you much harder to hit for most enemies. The shotgun does kick like a mule, but you'll almost always be using it at such close range, missing is basically impossible. There's just this great amount of balance and challenge that comes into play when engaging in shootouts, and the fact that you can always combine it with stealth makes for a game that's actually deceptively deep. I will admit the normal difficulty can feel a little closer to easy than hard with all the tools you're given to succeed, but then again, I did beat The Last of Us a total of 4, maybe 5 times in a row just to get footage for this video, so that is sort of expected. Of course, there are tougher difficulties though, and I recently tried out the grounded mode for the first time on stream, and I can confirm it almost completely changes the way you approach the game. Oh, and by the way, big ups to the kind of absolute psychopaths that actually play the permadeath mode in Remake. I genuinely fear you people. Anyways, combat in The Last of Us and your options in avoiding it are all really well-oiled mechanics. Each move you make, jaw you break, or shot you take, damn, I'm getting good at this, feels really substantial. Attacking in this game just feels like it hurts as much as it should, and it makes for a really great time. Now, I will admit, the first time I played the game, things just were not clicking with me. I've always been bad at aiming with thumbsticks, and on top of that, I have a naturally shaky grip, so the kind of preciseness it wanted out of me just was not happening. But when I started up the PS4 Remake a year or two later, things just sort of clicked into place. I'm definitely no speedrunner, and I doubt I'd be able to hang in its online mode back when it was still being played, but the game is pretty comfortable for me now, and I can do what I need to when I need to most of the time. The Last of Us is more of a jack of all trades, and the way it incorporates a lot of different systems often seen in modern games. It may not be the greatest stealth mechanics you've ever seen, but it still has a lot to offer, and the weighty, hard-hitting combat makes for a complete experience that feels incredibly polished. That being said though, like any game, with a close eye you'll be able to find a few scuffs on that mirror-like finish. Like I said before, once you wrap your head around how combat and stealth works, the game will seem a little too easy on its default difficulty, but there are a few encounters that stand out as being particularly frustrating. Which is okay technically, I mean the game should be testing you every once in a while, but the shitty thing is one of the worst defenders in my opinion is one of the first real stealth situations you find yourself in. After getting out of the city, Joel, Tess, and Ellie make their way into a nearly collapsed building, and there's a section where you'll need to stealth your way through a room full of infected. Unlike most sequences in the game, this one requires you to take out everything in the room so your partners can get through, and there's just something about this section that has always tripped me up. Maybe it's just me, but no matter what route I took or how I timed my grabs, I just always seem to get caught here, and at this point in the game, all you've got is a pistol and maybe a melee weapon, so until you're more familiar with the game's combat, you probably won't be putting these guys down easily when you end up getting caught. Of course, now that I've made my way through the game 4 or more times, I can pretty reliably get through this section with ease, but the only reason I can do that is because I've had so much practice with the game's mechanics. Something you probably won't have at this point since this is the very first time you've actually had to do this stuff against infected enemies. I guess there is a chance it could just be me, but I have always found this one part just a little too challenging for where it's set in the game, but let me know in the comments if I'm crazy on this one, that certainly is a possibility. Of course, countering that complaint, there is technically a way you can break the game. Typically, you have to use a shiv on clickers to get rid of them, which you'll definitely want to do since they are one-hit kills if they manage to get anywhere near you. Now, shivs are easy enough to craft in the moment, but you can find yourself out of them pretty often. And with clickers being so dangerous, you'll probably want to take them out with these shivs, which means you'll be in this situation a little more than you might think. For some reason though, there is sort of a workaround. Normally, using a bat or a pipe against a clicker is a gamble and not advised. There's a pretty good chance they'll break right through your attacks, and it takes a few hits to put them down, but if you use a brick or a glass bottle, well, you've just found yourself a free kill with a single hit. This one little strategy really shifts the difficulty even further in the direction of easy than before, since throwables can be found in abundance almost everywhere, and a pipe can take like 8 or 9 hits till it breaks. There is a bit of a trade-off here, since doing this will alert surrounding bad guys, and clickers are pretty fast, so they can still get to you, but it can still be a pretty OP strategy if you know what you're doing. As a quick note, the developers in the remake did put a band-aid on this by requiring a few more hits after the enemy is staggered by the throw, and I feel like this pretty much fixes the issue. And transitioning from something OP to something, well, the opposite of that, I found that in the PS3 original release of The Last of Us, Ellie would body block me a lot. I would be behind cover waiting for someone to pass so I could grab them, but Ellie in her infinite wisdom would use that exact moment to enact her genius plan to occupy the same space as me, which of course would push me out of cover and straight into the bad guy's line of sight. Now, I'm not sure if this was something the developers actively fixed after this initial release, but I found it to happen way less in the PS4 version and not at all on the PS5 remake. Going through this game with a fine-tooth comb for this video, I found it to be incredibly well put together and entirely consistent and satisfying. I could maybe see people criticizing its pace, since you often repeat the cycle of high-energy stealth immediately followed by slow exploration, but personally, I found this to be a winning formula. I really can't say enough how much fun I was able to have with The Last of Us over the last few weeks, and these repeat playthroughs have only made me appreciate it more. I may not exactly be a stealth game aficionado, but I do know when multiple systems come together to form a very responsive experience. And believe me when I say, whether or not you're choking someone out, stomping their teeth in, or getting off a headshot, you've never played a game with such crunchy, weighty feedback. If it doesn't click with you at first, I've been there before. Trust me and just give it some time. It's not exactly a common style to see in games, but it does grow on you, and when you've really figured out what it wants from you, the fun you can have in this world is almost infinite.
That was too damn close.
Alright, now we're getting into the real shit. The Last of Us was a graphical showcase of immense proportions, no matter how you look at it, and since we've got so much to cover in that department, I'm gonna have to structure things a little differently than usual. First, I'd like to analyze the PS3 original so that we can both set up a good baseline of the game's origins and get a bit of a refresher for those of you who haven't returned to this original release in a while, which I'm gonna assume is most of you. Then, of course, we'll move in chronological order, covering the 2 other releases, going over any kind of presentation improvements, followed by any gameplay or balance changes until we eventually get to the recently released remake. And yes, at least a small portion of that time will be spent discussing the controversy surrounding the remake, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, you're far more lucky than I am, believe me. Alright, so let's kick things off for the very first time PS3 owners would be plopped down into the world of The Last of Us, and as far as I'm concerned, it was a pretty damn memorable moment.
Let's get on with it.
Before the thing even hit shelves, praise was already falling at its feet for how damn good it looked, which I'd say is more than deserved. The game pushed the PlayStation 3 to its absolute limits, there's no doubt about it, but you'd figured that'd be the case since it was released on the console the same exact year the PS4 dropped. Now, it does seem a little odd for Naughty Dog to have not just waited for the objectively better hardware to get into customer hands and then just release the game on that platform, but I would imagine this thing was in production quite a long time, and by the point they had access to PS4 dev kits, they were probably just past the point of no return in development terms. And thanks to a tweet thread a buddy recently made me aware of, I can totally buy this game taking a hell of a lot of time to finish. According to one of the people who worked on it, facial animations in The Last of Us weren't even mocapped. They essentially just filmed the actors' faces and then hand animated each scene frame by frame, face by face, using the footage as a reference. Keeping in mind the sheer amount of cutscenes in this thing, that becomes even more impressive, which is a hard feat to top, admittedly. In booting The Last of Us up, the benefits of releasing on a console whose secrets had already essentially been discovered is clear from the very start. The game was an absolute marvel in its day. Character models were amazingly detailed, environments were some of the best I'd ever seen, and the lighting was just something else. During development, Naughty Dog decided to lean pretty heavily into the game's setting in terms of presentation. The world had essentially ended, and as such, the vast majority of light you'd be coming across in The Last of Us would not be coming from an outlet. Nope, natural light was the chief focus here, and that can be a tough act to pull off on such aging hardware. Sure, at the time, it was fairly easy to pull off convincing lighting in, say, a small hallway lit by fluorescent bulbs, but approximating believable light behavior in a wide-open landscape where the light source was so far from what it was lighting, well, I imagine it was one hell of a challenge. Thanks to this approach, most interior areas in the game use some form of indirect lighting, which, while still pre-baked, looks incredibly convincing and realistic. Now, you guys know I prefer that hard-edged, very well-defined look that early to mid-2000s PC games often used in terms of lighting, and the indirect nature of the lighting in The Last of Us makes that look almost impossible in most areas, but holy hell does it still look incredible. Regardless of the method used, I can't think of anything on the PS3 that looked this good and this convincing at the same time. The game also made use of really cool post-processing techniques like bloom lighting, depth of field, and 2D particle meshes to help sell the look, and when everything's in motion, that is exactly what it does. Now, we've talked a lot about lighting, but there is of course its diametric opposite. The Last of Us had some absolutely killer real-time shadow casting. Of course, not every light source would produce perspective-correct shadows, but your flashlight definitely does, and the effect was amazing looking. Really though, you could say that about any aspect of the game's presentation. It was a showstopper and one of those benchmark releases that should always be regarded as a force for pushing the medium forward. Now, you may have noticed I am starting out with a lot of praise here, and that's because in a second I'm about to heavily criticize just about every single other aspect of this game's presentation. After coming back to the original PS3 release after all of these years, I found that, well, things aren't quite as amazing as I may have remembered.
Sounds like might be trouble in paradise.
But before I get into that, I need you guys to understand two very important things. First off, a majority of the problems I'm about to list are nowhere near unique to The Last of Us. During gaming's first official HD generation, we had yet to figure out the whole looks versus performance thing, and hell, you could argue that's still the case. But regardless, a lot of the performance issues I'm about to talk about are shared across most game releases on both major platforms at the time. The PS3 and 360, while technically capable of HD graphics, just could not keep up with the drive of developers wanting to squeeze every ounce of graphical fidelity from them. Second, and most importantly, this game, when viewed through the lens of a PS3 release that is pushing 10 years old, still impresses today. Now, it may not stack up to modern releases in motion, but as far as artistry is considered, it still hangs with the big dogs in my opinion. Okay, so what do you say we get this beating started? In 2022, the very first thing you're gonna notice when booting up The Last of Us is its 720p video output. Now, I will say, compared to other titles released on the platform, this is a relatively sharp 720p picture. I mean, details are easy enough to make out, and while the nature of HD's lowest possible vertical resolution does make for a more blurry picture than I'd like, it's about as good as you can get within that limitation. Sadly though, there is an ugly low-resolution static effect on screen at all times, which certainly does not help things. Now personally, I've never enjoyed these static overlays because their main job always seems to be obscuring the sharp picture I typically want to see in a game, but I think The Last of Us has a particularly bad-looking version of this effect. Of course, after your eyes get used to the bad static effect and looking at such a low-resolution image in general, you'll see the game still able to punch above its weight class, but trust me, there are other factors working against it here. Most annoying being its 30 frame per second performance ceiling. To put things bluntly, coming back to this game recently was incredibly hard for me. The choppy movement and noticeably slow response time is very hard to come to grips with nowadays. Aside from the molasses-like performance just feeling really gross, it also affects how well you can play the game. There's just this constant lag from pressing a button to seeing that action play out on screen, and in fairness, at least a portion of that goes towards very fluid animations having to play out first. That being said, the rest of the blame goes towards the 30 FPS handling speed, and in moments where fast reactions are required, you're just going to find yourself coming up short a lot. Now that being said, a slow overall frame rate can technically be acclimated to. I mean, I was able to beat the game with no real issue back then and now, but you're always going to sort of be aware of the restrictions being placed on you. It feels like a constant force pulling the gameplay down a bit in my opinion, but that's not the only thing making for a rough time here. You guys know a slow frame rate can be bad enough, but an inconsistently slow frame rate can be absolutely maddening. Like I said before, the game does target 30 frames per second, but believe me when I say it almost never hits that target. From the most graphically demanding scenes to Sarah just sort of walking around her living room at the start, The Last of Us can more reliably be found sitting around 24 to 28 frames per second, although trust me, it can drop much further. And thanks to the overall low frame rate it's operating at, you are going to feel each and every one of those dips. It really gets in the way of playing this thing proficiently because there's no getting used to the frame rate when that frame rate is fluctuating from second to second. To put this issue simply, this console just flat out could not handle The Last of Us, and its performance is easily its worst issue. But as hard as it is to believe, it gets even worse from here. The entire game suffers from this very odd-looking, smeary motion blur effect, which normally isn't something I complain much about, but it is always running. It's applied to any slight camera movement and can be incredibly jarring. I'm going to take this scene here and slow it down so you can see it a little better, but believe you me, it's very visible in real time. I'm going to assume this was an attempt at preventing the player from being able to notice just how bad the performance is, because a lot of times motion blur is used in this way, but instead it just makes your screen look like it's been smeared by Vaseline every time you need to look around. It does affect whole 3D models and the background as well, but it's most noticeable when it's being applied to edges and small details like Joel's hair. A big problem since you'll be looking at the back of this guy's head for like 99% of your time with the game. Now, this certainly isn't the worst screen blur effect I've ever seen before. After all, I did own Final Fantasy Type 0's remaster before it was patched, but trust me, it's bad. Of course, this issue is bad on its own, but there is a compounding problem to be considered here. In my opinion, The Last of Us suffers from a dismally shallow FOV. Now, I'm sure this wasn't a mistake. I did read somewhere that they used RE4's third-person camera as an inspiration, a claim that is very easy to believe since nearly every third-person perspective seen in a video game since RE4's release took a similar approach. So the camera stays this close to Joel's back intentionally, but because of this you don't have very much peripheral vision, which means you're going to have to move the camera a lot, and like I said before, that's tantamount to covering your TV in Vaseline. Because you'll often be exploring indoor environments and the game likes to hide resources all over the place, I felt like I was constantly shifting the camera around like a tweaker looking for a fix, and having 3D models noticeably blur every time I did that made for a really bad time. My wife, who was playing the game with me at the time, would have to look away from the screen when I was searching for crafting items because the blur combined with the constant low FPS camera movement made her want to barf.
I feel sick.
I'll be honest with you guys, going back to The Last of Us after all of these years, I was pretty surprised to find it not exactly living up to how I remembered it. Now, it being a 10-year-old title, of course I wasn't expecting a modern experience, but I think Naughty Dog would have probably done well to have just waited for the PS4 to release first. This game just clearly has trouble running on a PS3, and in ways that aren't just me being picky, although I am kind of picky. According to reviews at the time, some of these issues actively prevented people from playing the game, either because it made controlling it harder than it had to be, or worst case scenario, triggered some kind of motion sickness for them, like with my wife. Now, like I said at the start of this whole thing, it is very important to note that while the performance may be pretty bottom of the barrel, the artistry behind all of this is still mesmerizing. I still have to step back in awe at everything this game was able to do with the comparatively low-end hardware they were working with. I know I just spent an eternity shitting on how all of this feels in motion, and that may give off the wrong impression, but trust me when I say this is still an incredible looking game. I was just really surprised to see how bad it performed compared to what I remembered. All that being said, however, you just flat out cannot argue with how impressive the game still looks today. Every screen has such heartfelt detail poured into it, you can really tell this was a nearly obsessive passion project for the team, and they were willing to sacrifice nearly everything in order to see their vision come to fruition. Sadly, the platform they decided to develop on just couldn't keep pace with their imagination, a problem that would luckily be remedied in round about 1 year. The PS4 remaster of The Last of Us was pretty great news for me. Not only am I all for graphical upgrades for video games in the form of remasters, but this version promised to correct a universal wrong from the original by allowing for a full 1080p 60, and I'm happy to say that's exactly what it achieves. Outside of that, they also included the Left Behind DLC and a bunch of stuff for the multiplayer mode that I really never touched. There are also claims of a lot of improvements to the graphical features in the original, and if I'm being honest with you, aside from the shadows being sharper, a better draw distance, and obviously the resolution, I can't tell much of a difference between the two. I guess the remaster does offer a more contrasty, punchy, sort of darker picture, but I guess depending on the settings you have your TV at, you may not even notice this. But holy hell, you want a night and day difference in gameplay? Go ahead and play the PS3 original, followed immediately by this remaster. It is infinitely more fun to play, and the overall feel is so much more responsive. Hell, even navigating the menus is noticeably snappier. I'm not joking, for real, try to move your cursor around on the menus in both versions, it's insane the difference. On top of that, and most obviously, the picture is just so much more clear and easy on the eyes now that we're dealing with 1080p. You know, in 2022, it can be a little easy to forget how much of a jump up 1080p is from 720 since it's only the next step up in resolution, but man, the difference here is palpable. In fact, the first time I played the remaster, the added clarity made me realize that cutscenes I had always assumed were real-time back when I first played the game were actually pre-rendered, thanks to the unquestionable upgrade that comes with both 1080p and 60 frames per second, along with everything else that's offered. It's admittedly really hard to go back to the PS3 original once you've had this remaster in your hands, which I guess is okay because there's no real need to now that this has been released. There's really nothing in the original that can't be found in higher fidelity or higher quality here, and unless you're a weirdo like me who likes checking out old, outdated games just to see how they hold up today, there's no reason to spin up your original copy. Of course, that doesn't mean this is a perfect remaster. There are a few minor issues I managed to notice, and I just wouldn't be me if I didn't talk about them. First off, the game keeps up a fairly solid-ish frame rate, but there is the odd dip below 60, and when that happens, it's a pretty noticeable dive. Now, this isn't something that showed up even 20% of the time, but when it did, it was noticeable, and for an upscale of an old 720p PS3 game, it feels a little unnecessary. On top of that, the higher resolution, while definitely appreciated, can also make certain things noticeable that may have been a little harder to see at 720p. For example, like I said before, the shadows are noticeably sharper here, but they're also heavily aliased, and speaking of which, there seems to be a lack of anti-aliasing on distant objects, and it makes for a sort of shimmering effect when there's a lot of small details packed into a single focal point off in the distance. An artifact that may not be quite so bad if this weren't a game where you'll primarily be walking forward in old desolated cityscapes just sort of staring off into the horizon. Also, I'm very sad to say the gross-looking film grain from the original is still here, and just like before, I feel like it's an unnecessary inclusion that only serves to mask how sharp the picture could be otherwise. I'm not really sure how well it's going to show up on YouTube after it's been compressed to hell and back, but hopefully you can see what I'm talking about. Speaking of stuff that's returned, the really bad-looking motion blur is back, and thanks to the cleaner picture, it's even worse looking than before. Which is sort of odd that it would be here because you'd figure such an aggressive blur was applied to compensate for the god-awful frame rate in the original. Now that the game runs at a nearly sort of reliable 60 frames per second, it just seems like this gets in the way of the game's visuals a little too much. On the plus side, I think the blur applied to the background is pretty okay looking, but the odd smeared edges still look horrible and they still are going to show up a lot. Now this next one, I'm not really sure if it's a new problem or maybe if the cleaner picture is just letting me see it for the first time, but every single reflection I came across in this remaster was fake. Now what I mean by that is they aren't actually reflecting you or your surroundings, but instead some odd image that I guess was made to give the illusion of real-time reflections. This faux reflection effect, I guess, would be passable if you weren't really paying much attention, but once it catches your eye, it's pretty hard not to see it everywhere. Especially since reflections have been incorrectly applied to non-glossy dry surfaces, like this table here or the decades-old concrete with no water on it. And with a fake trick like this, I probably shouldn't be surprised, but they aren't perspective correct either, meaning you're going to get the same image no matter what direction you're facing when you're looking at it. Overall, despite the petty complaints I just listed, I'd say this remaster is right up there with some of the better ones I've seen. I mean, sure, it doesn't add anything new to the game, but to be fair, The Last of Us was, in my opinion, already one hell of a complete title. If you're like me and you were just looking to play a game that you love, but with much better visuals and a frame rate it probably should have had in the first place, this thing's a godsend. And you'd figure with such a tight package, the only way this remaster could go with a popularization of 4K gaming would be up, but you'd sort of be wrong.
Take all my food, too, while you're at it.
By the looks of it, you could lose some of that food.
Listen to me, you little shit.
After the release of the PS4 Pro, a 4K capable console, the words capable requiring the largest quotations allowable, The Last of Us would see an update letting it take advantage of the extra horsepower that console could afford, or at least that was the intention going in. Now, in the interest of fairness, I don't actually own a PS4 Pro, so I captured all of my footage with a PS5, which in this situation theoretically is the same thing, but don't worry, I've got some outside results to back up what I found here. Before we get into that though, this update allowed for some really interesting video options. There's a 1080p mode with higher quality shadows and a locked 60 FPS, an 1800p mode with lower quality shadows and a 60 FPS target, and finally a locked 30 frames per second option that will give you the full 2160p vertical resolution of 4K and those higher quality shadows to boot. Now, if you ask me, 4K or no 4K, 30 frames per second is absolutely unacceptable today, and to be honest, it was unacceptable when this game released. So I really couldn't see why someone would even try this mode out outside of sheer curiosity. I mean, I guess if you're coming from the PS3 original to this version, maybe the 4K mode would give you a much higher resolution and the same 30 FPS you're used to, but if you ask me, a playable frame rate is always going to trump higher resolutions. That being the case, I captured all of my footage with the 1800p option and found performance to be a little worse than the original remaster's 1080p mode. The difference in sharpness is definitely noticeable at a glance, depending on the situation, but to be honest, the softer picture of the 4K remaster's 1080p mode makes for a smoother image while maintaining clarity. And that's because this update of the game allows you to run these resolutions internally while the PS4 upscales the resulting image to 4K. It's actually a kinda cool feature, and at the very least I would argue it's sort of worth the resulting slight jump down in performance you'll get between this and the original remaster. Now, if you guys ask me, 1800p looks great to my eye, but on a big TV that's likely to blow up any aliasing, the smoother, more softer looking upscaled 1080p might make for a slightly more pleasing picture if you value clean lines over sharpness. Just know that if you choose this option, I'm not going to be mad, but I will be a little disappointed. Now, the only problem with this whole setup is the extra overhead needed for the upscaling, leading this version of the remaster to actually run a little worse than the original remaster on a base model PS4. I mean, yeah, it is kind of strange, but both consoles running the same game at the same internal 1080p, and it's the more powerful one that ends up falling behind. Oh, and by the way, I'm sort of borrowing the graph on screen from Digital Foundry because I don't own a PS4 Pro and I wanted something a little more authentic, but I will be linking their video down in the description below. Trust me, everything that I sort of flirt with in my videos, these guys are the authority on. You should be checking them out before you ever hear what I have to say on anything. Now, personally, despite the shit that I just talked, I couldn't really choose between 1080p and 1800p, so I just ended up switching between the two pretty evenly, and the difference in consistent frame rate is noticeable, but I didn't find either of the two options to be non-viable. Sadly though, the same just cannot be said for 4K. I could not go back to playing this game at 30 FPS, so this option may as well have not existed for me. However, an interesting little tidbit is that the added performance overhead that comes from setting the game to 4K at a locked 30 FPS nets you some higher resolution shadows compared to the 1800p 60 FPS mode. Still definitely not worth playing the game at such a compromised experience, but I guess interesting nonetheless. I don't know, I kind of feel like this version of the remaster doesn't stack up to the original release of the remaster, and it's a bit of an anomaly. A release that hit consoles during that middle ground when 4K was technically an option, but the hardware just was not ready to commit to it yet. If you have a PS5 or you're one of the few people who have a PS4, I guess this would theoretically be an okay way to go. I mean, there is a bit of a trade-off in performance, but it's not so egregious that it's not worth picking up, or at least not for that reason. See, we've got ourselves a brand new option when it comes to playing The Last of Us, and I assume it's the one you've all been waiting to see.
Let's just be cool, man. Take it easy, alright? No, don't.
Okay, so I have to apologize here. I know a lot of you were looking forward to seeing how well this remake holds up, and you definitely will, but I couldn't rightly talk about this thing without at least broaching the controversy surrounding its release. The very second screenshots and information leaked regarding this project, several factors led to the internet losing its collective fucking mind. There were all kinds of issues being hurled at the project, and while some were justified, I'd wager a majority came from people who either didn't understand what the remake was or were pissed off about false information they heard secondhand. And I'm nothing if not an internet asshole myself, so at the risk of giving away the entire point of this section of the video, The Last of Us Part 1 is just incredible. I think it deserves a place up there with some of the better remakes in the medium, and without a doubt, I've already lost some of you just by saying that, which is a shame. But for those of you who are left, I'm going to try and take the most prevalent arguments I've seen on the matter and at least try to offer some sort of explanation so we can just cover this thing and what it is as opposed to what everyone seems to think it is.
That is a stupid idea.
Starting off with the issue that is by far the most common, or at least it seems that way to me, this is just a cash grab. And, well, I mean, yeah, of course it is. This is the video game industry. If you think you can point to a single AAA game released in the last decade without the singular expressed goal of turning a profit, well, you'll be doing so from within the re-education camps where I'm assuming you've been made to believe that. Now, I'm not making any statements here, but let's just put it this way, I'm not going to trust you around any Kool-Aid anytime soon. I mean, saying this game is a cash grab is like saying air is slightly necessary for human life because, of course, it's an attempt at making a large amount of money. Literally everything is. I've got news for you, the house or apartment you're watching this in was not built specifically because the massive corporation who did it wanted you to have a roof over your head. Now the real question is, how do they go about making that money? Because if they offer a low effort, low quality product, you can't really expect them to get a very profitable return on their development investment. So if this is a cash grab, which it undoubtedly is, like every single game released outside the indie scene, it's still in their best interest to deliver something we're going to enjoy or appreciate in some kind of way, or else the whole cash grab thing doesn't really work. Which I think we both know is going to lead to the same end result you get from playing any other game. So try not to get too caught up in thinking of game releases as being purely profit driven, because, well, they all are, but if the developers are any good at their job, that's not really going to matter very much. Which leads us to the next issue people seem to have en masse. This remake, good or not, sets a bad precedent with its $70 price tag, and, well, I agree with you there. It is without a doubt really bad to see the price of Sony exclusives go up by $10. Trust me, you're not going to find this guy arguing for higher priced video games. Those of you who know me know that when I go out game hunting, I have a hard $20 ceiling to any non-new video game I purchase. So if you're making that argument, you're going to need to point it elsewhere because I'm in total agreement, in theory. See, the only issue there is your target. Those of you who are paying attention to what I just said will already have heard the obvious reason for this. This was not a Naughty Dog decision, and it surely isn't something you can throw at The Last of Us specifically. This was an edict from Sony itself, the company who licenses developers to release on their platform. Not only was The Last of Us nowhere near the first flagship PS5 game to cost $70, but it's likely not even the first PS5 game people making this argument have paid $70 for. Honestly, out of everything I'm about to list here, this is the only issue I would say is wholly disingenuous and unreasonable. By all means, be upset that Sony has increased the price of games released on its platform. Trust me, I am too. But you can't rightly go around blaming a developer for following the rules Sony has given to them and then paint them as setting a bad precedent. They aren't setting prices or precedents here, trust me. Your indignation is most certainly well earned, but you're essentially yelling at a McDonald's cashier because you don't like the policy set by the millionaires who run the franchise. And before you say it, because I just know you want to, well, what about Capcom and other developers choosing not to go along with the $70 price point? Well, if you haven't done much research, this may sound like a solid rebuttal, but it only takes a total of maybe 2 mouse clicks to find out this is mandatory for first-party releases, and in case you were wondering, Naughty Dog is very much owned by Sony. Okay, so I guess the TLDR here is this. $70 video games, bad. Naughty Dog releasing a $70 video game because the platform they released it on said it had to be $70, also bad, just not Naughty Dog's fault. The $70 price point does, however, lead us into our next argument. $70 is way too much for a simple remake, and to be totally honest, there's not a lot I can say about that. Listen, a value judgment like that is far too subjective for me to say it's wrong or right. Everyone's going to have different aspects of a game that they find to be valuable, and if this isn't something you can justify spending $70 on, fair enough. I do think, however, this sort of falsely portrays the amount of work that went into this thing, and to talk about that, we're going to need to make a distinction here. I have seen a lot of people on Twitter and YouTube comments calling this a remaster, which just hurts my soul. So if you were unaware, a remaster is when a developer takes a game and allows it to run on more powerful hardware. That often comes with a bump up in resolution, but that up-res job is being applied to the same assets that existed in the original release. Now, sometimes you may find developers that make changes to those original assets so they look a little better at the higher resolution, but those changes are still sitting on top of those original assets. In that same vein, you may see less pliable assets like 2D art or sprite-based fonts totally replaced, like in the Chrono Cross Remaster or the Resident Evil Remaster, but for all intents and purposes, this is the exact same game as far as its code and makeup goes. A remake, on the other hand, is when a developer takes a video game and fully recreates it from the ground up from new assets, oddly enough, again, like Resident Evil, except for this time it's the Resident Evil Remake and not the Resident Evil Remake Remaster, because one's a remake, but the other one's a remaster, but they're the same game, so it's a remake. Listen, I never said this wasn't going to be complicated.
Man, it's confusing.
You just gotta play it a couple times. It all makes sense.
Complicated or not, though, a remake is exactly what Part 1 is. Nearly every single environment, character model, piece of text, and menu has been fully remade in a brand new package. To my knowledge, the only thing that exists exactly like it was in the original release is the voice acting and soundtrack. Two things so damn good, I think we're not going to be too disappointed that we just got the originals. Now, in my personal opinion, the sheer upgrade in visual fidelity here compared to the original release, and hell, even the PS4 Remaster, is well worth my $70. And that's not to mention there have been several quality of life updates here that makes for an experience that's going to feel like The Last of Us you know and love, but operates a bit more smoothly and satisfyingly. So I'd say in my mind, this game more than earns its price tag. Now, if that's not the case for you, I can totally understand. Personally, I don't enjoy Pokemon games very much, so no matter what's added in the next entry in the series, I'm likely not going to think it's worth spending my money on. Well, maybe some of you guys do. That's why I try my hardest to keep away from value-based arguments concerning video games. It's like arguing over what you think tastes better. The criteria there is going to be different for everyone involved, and there's just no point in engaging in debates that can technically never end. And to finish off this recap of petty arguments I've had with people on Twitter, I'll end on what seemed to be the most common issue before Part 1's relaunch. It's ridiculous to remake a game that was made so recently. Alright, now I'm going to warn you ahead of time, I'm going to be a little mean here, because, well, that's a pretty dumb thing to say. The Last of Us was released a whole ass decade ago, guys. I'd say 10 years and a massive jump up in gaming tech is a good amount of time and reason to start remaking stuff. Here, think of it this way, and I know I'm hammering this title a lot in this video, but the Resident Evil remake was released just 5 or 6 years after the PS1 original. That's the kind of graphical leap that could be seen in such a short amount of time. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, what about the PS4 Remaster of The Last of Us? And I hate to break this to you, but that damn thing hit shelves just 1 year after the original. Now I'm going to be honest with you, if you're splitting hairs over what can and cannot be remade and the difference between 9 and 10 years is a bridge too far for you, I don't think there's much anyone could say to sway you, because you're probably insane. And for those of you in the "this game didn't need a remake" camp, I mean, yeah, literally no game needs a remake. It's just nice to play a game you love, but see it operating in a visual environment that reflects the amount of technological progress that was made since its original release. This stuff isn't exactly rocket science. It's just a fun way to re-engage with a game you've likely already played to death. When a remake drops, all of a sudden a title you've explored every nook and cranny in becomes new in a way, and maybe, just maybe, you get to re-experience just a bit of that glorious first playthrough. In the same category, I've seen a lot of people say that there's no point in remaking a game if it's just going to be a visual overhaul. An idea that I vehemently disagree with, but I think over the years, people have developed a pretty ridiculous definition of what a remake means. Look, pure and simple, a remake is when you take a game and recreate it in a way that mirrors its original form. For whatever reason, games media has taken this position that a remake should wholly change that experience. The thought behind that being, why remake it if you can't add anything new? And I think the counter there isn't obvious, because that's not what a fucking remake is. Look, if a developer wants to add to or alter their original creation with a remake, that's fine. Plenty of developers have done that with great success, but it's not baked into the idea of a remake like people seem to think. I would have to assume what these people are talking about is a reimagining because they don't seem to want the original, they want the original but different, which is weird. You just play a new game at that point, I think. Now, personally, I of course would prefer an experience that tries its absolute hardest to stay true to the original, or at the very least the intent behind the original. But of course I can admit there are times when the opposite approach works really well. Titles like Silent Hill Shattered Memories and RE2 Remake are great despite the fact that they couldn't be more different from the games that served as their inspiration. And if we keep going down that route, we're going to eventually get to the RE3 Remake, a title that follows the logic of why remake it if you're going to make it exactly the same. Sections of the game were altered to follow a new game pace, whole mechanics were changed, and parts of the original were left on the cutting room floor, and bam. Just like that, the internet's argument becomes about staying true to the original. Look, what I'm trying to say here is that the standard being held to this one title is not consistent at all, because as soon as a remake comes around that you don't like, you're just going to get mad that too much was changed. Really though, I think this all culminates to a single point. If you don't like The Last of Us for whatever reason, that's fine. It may not be for you, or you may disagree with it being made in the first place, but no matter what your issue is, you don't have to play it. It doesn't need to affect you in any way. You may disagree with the price, or the changes made to character models, or any other legitimate grievance, but at the end of the day, this project did not take time and effort away from any other game you're interested in, so maybe put things into perspective. This is not the great issue of our generation. You're not fighting the good fight, and it's not the crack that destroyed the dam. It's just a solidly made, well-playing, incredibly beautiful remake of a game that was already pretty cool. And speaking of which, maybe it's time we actually talked about all that stuff instead of me arguing with imaginary people.
Oh, why are these all stuck together? I'm just fucking with you.
A conversation that sadly can only start once we've navigated the fairly insane amount of video output settings that can be found here. I'll be honest with you guys, the sheer amount of options here is even intimidating to me, and I live for this kind of stuff, so let's simplify things a bit. First off, we've got two categories. There's performance and fidelity modes you can choose from. Fidelity being a native 4K output, and performance netting you an internal 1440p that gets scaled to 4K after the fact. Now you may be asking yourself, why in the hell would I ever choose the lower resolution mode? Well, that native 4K option only offers a piss poor 30 FPS frame rate, and I'm sorry, but 30 frames per second in 2022 is just flat out unacceptable. I know everyone has their preference, but the fact of the matter is a smoother, more consistent frame rate is going to equal smoother, more consistent gameplay 99.9% of the time. So moving forward with this video, you'll primarily be seeing Part 1's performance mode, which allows for an impressively solid 60 FPS target. Sorry guys, I know a lot of you are probably looking forward to that full 4K, but I'm just flat out unwilling to sacrifice how well a game plays just to eliminate slight aliasing that you nor I are likely to see sitting more than 6 feet away from our respective TVs. Really though, those are the only two factors that need covering on my end. Of course, you can also unlock your console's 120Hz support, variable refresh, and HDR modes, but sadly I can't capture any of those features in motion. I will, however, let you know that the 120Hz toggle is not an automatic fix for Fidelity mode's low frame rate. You will add an extra 10 FPS to that 30 frame per second ceiling, but don't count on the game consistently hitting that target. Essentially, you'll be trading one locked but very low frame rate for one that's a little higher but is more inconsistent, which I would argue is way worse. As for performance mode's use of 120Hz, well, I'd recommend the hell out of it. I mean, it's exactly what I'd be using myself if I didn't have to capture footage for this video. Okay, so that covers the boring stuff, so let's jump into what this remake has to offer, and that's an easy subject to talk about because every single inch of this thing is glorious to look at.
Man,
What?
nothing. It's just... I've never seen anything like this, that's all.
Nearly every single aspect of the game's presentation has been reworked and noticeably improved on. Lighting, particle effects, resolution, physics, animation, post-processing, everything has seen upgrades that really shows off how much gaming tech has progressed in the last 10 years. But I think we should probably start with the most controversial change to be found here, one that you've likely already noticed. Naughty Dog, in the interest of making things a little more photorealistic, have opted for all new designs for the Last of Us characters, or at least their faces. Their stated goal was to get rid of the stylized look from the original now that they were able to render more realistic facial features, but personally, I don't think this was necessary. While yes, the originals were a little more stylized than true to life, I don't think they gave off an inauthentic look, and the old faces certainly would have fit in with the new photorealistic graphics of the remake. I sort of get wanting more natural proportions and features, but the downside is that I find these new faces a little less stylistically attractive, which might be my own personal taste, or just the fact that I had grown accustomed to the originals, who knows. These new faces definitely look great from a technological point of view, like you can see all of the effort that went into making them, but I still would have preferred the original look. Plus, let's be honest here, Tess now looks like the kind of woman all Floridians have seen roaming the trailer park looking to score pills. And for added authenticity, she's even got meth mouth. All that being said though, I did eventually get used to the new faces, and even in Bill's case thought it was a massive improvement, but your mileage will definitely vary. It's just kind of a taste thing. What cannot be chalked up to taste though is the crazy amount of additional work done to facial animations in this remake. It looks like tons of points of articulation were added to the faces here, specifically around the eyes and mouth, and since I recently found out these animations were hand done in the original, I've got to assume they just remade them all together because I can't see anything else being efficient here. Don't get me wrong, I'm not exactly an expert at this kind of stuff, but it seems to me it would have been just as much work adding all these new points of articulation and making these new animations work with the old ones as it would to just, I don't know, scrap everything and start again. Regardless of how they did it though, you're gonna see a lot more facial expressiveness in the cutscenes, which really helps the already emotionally gut-wrenching performances shine even brighter. If you want my opinion, this may as well be the single greatest addition seen in this remake. Even the jump up to 4K seems less impressive by comparison, and I think that's because The Last of Us was built around these emotional performances, and improving them essentially means improving the game's very best feature.
I shot the hell out of that guy, huh?
Oh, and while we're at it, those cutscenes are now in-engine real-time affairs compared to the pre-rendered nature of the originals, and I have to say, this was an amazingly noticeable improvement. Outside of an obvious increase in visual fidelity here, since these scenes no longer have to be compressed down to fit on the disc, there's also no more cuts to black before and after they start, which I thought was really cool and immersive. Another massive improvement can be found in the realm of lighting. Now, like I said before, the original Last of Us really focused on natural lighting and, in my opinion, made some huge strides in the category at the time. The remake, however, may as well be existing on an entirely different planet. Lighting in Part 1 is almost volumetric in nature. The light seems to have mass and truly fills the room you're in. You get the feeling you can actually reach out and touch the soft glow pouring in from windows or holes in the ceiling, and it's an effect that truly improves on an already impressive framework. And with a massive focus on amazing looking lighting comes the obvious shadows cast by that light, and part 1 does not fall behind here. Shadows in this game look very convincing, and unlike a lot of AAA games going for impressive lighting, the shadows here stick with a more natural look, so in a lot of instances you might not even notice there are real-time perspective correct shadows being cast by a single open window. They are going to wow you in terms of how realistic they look, but they're not something you'll always be aware you're looking at. I really like the shadows casted by the sun have an expected softness to them, and I guess since we're talking about it, most shadows do as well. The original game certainly did what it could with the hardware available to it, and it's still impressive today, but I will say, looking back, they were pretty low res and very alias looking. Checking out the remake side by side with the remaster, and the resulting upgrade in natural light and shadow casting is amazingly clear. And when we're talking light, we eventually have to get to reflections. One area where the original and remaster sort of struggled, and by struggled I mean dropped the ball. All of the reflections found in those original releases were actually tricks meant to make it look like they were real-time reflections of the environment taking place, when in reality they seemed to be pre-baked image maps that didn't change with perspective. Well, surprise, surprise, this is yet another scenario where Remake is just in a league of its own by comparison. This remake is littered with perspective-correct, accurate reflections that manage to look pretty damn good at a glance. The game uses screen space reflections instead of a ray trace solution, something you probably should have assumed when none of the footage you've been seeing so far has been running below 20 frames per second. Now, I've been well known to criticize SSR because of how grainy reflections looked in titles like Resident Evil 2 Remake and Control, and I'm not gonna lie to you, there is a bit of that graininess here, but I think this is the most clear I've seen the solution look. And of course, you will lose a bit of that graininess and aliasing when switching to 4K if you're okay with playing at 30 frames per second. At 1440p though, I'd say these things look great to my eye, especially if you're playing the game normally and not stopping to analyze every inch of it like I'm one to do. It looks like we're probably dealing with less than quarter resolution images in these reflections, which is about what I would expect, and you will notice the aliasing when you're looking close, but like I said, in normal gameplay circumstances, this won't be something you'll really know that you're seeing. I also noticed that bodies of water will realistically reflect the light from your flashlight on your surroundings in the right conditions, and I thought this was really damn cool. Oh, and thanks to my buddy Benny for pointing this out, but in the Pittsburgh section of the game, there's a random puddle that for whatever reason reflects a full resolution image at a certain angle. I'm not really sure why it's happening here, and I haven't found any other areas that do this, but I don't know, that's kind of cool, right? In my mind, this one little glitch, I guess you could call it, is a bit of a look into a future where maybe we can get our hands on full resolution, real-time, perspective-correct reflections without burning down the hardware inside of our consoles. In motion, the lighting, shadow casting, and screen space reflections combine for an incredibly convincing picture, one that I just can't stop being impressed by. As me and my wife played through this game to get this footage, we both just couldn't stop remarking how damn good it looked. It was almost like every single second of the game's runtime was one-upping the last in terms of visual fidelity. I've got some good news for you though. The improvements don't just come in the form of raw horsepower. There are some stylistic changes made here that I would say fit more into the quality of life side of things. For example, when entering an area with a lot of spores in the original, we had this gross, thick, sort of green-tinted 2D fog mesh on screen that made it pretty damn hard to see anything. Okay, so I know that was sort of the point to these sections, but I found it to be really ugly looking, and in my opinion, this had a slightly negative effect on gameplay. Well, now these sections have cleared up considerably. There's still post-processing and real-time effects to let you know you're surrounded by deadly fungal spores, but now you can actually see what the environment looks like. Oh, and the particle effects in these sections have received a massive upgrade. I love that it's not just a 2D flat animation applied to the screen, but instead these particles seem to exist in 3D space and change with your perspective. I mean, talk about going that extra mile. The difference here is just flat out crazy. In terms of changes that are a little more contentious, Remake seems to lack a lot of the color saturation that the original releases had. Talking to people on stream, it seems like the general consensus is that Remake is washed out, but switching between the two, I would say this is more of a correction. In my opinion, the original was a little too saturated and had too heavy a reliance on unnaturally high contrast levels. Maybe the less saturated picture is a result of the more natural, realistic approach going into Remake, but I'd say regardless of the reasoning, I prefer this neutral look compared to the more harsh visuals found in the original. Seeing the two side by side, the garish saturation and focus on high contrast made characters in the original seem to glow, while the remake just gives off a more convincing appearance by comparison and, at least in my opinion, is a little more visually attractive. It seems to me the team at Naughty Dog's approach with this remake was focused around staying in the realm of visual improvements, which is nice because aside from fixing game-breaking bugs or little inconveniences, that's what I normally look for in these things. I know there's a camp of people who worship at the why remake it if it's just going to be a visual upgrade alter, and truthfully the answer is because I already enjoyed this game immensely, and the only thing that in my opinion aged sort of poorly about it was its look. Now we can argue till the cows come home about the objective truth, which is what I'm talking about, and whatever your opinion may be, but realistically speaking, that's the way the remake is, and in my opinion I think that was the right way to go. However, that's not to say there haven't been some tweaks made here. I noticed the gunplay seems to feel much tighter and more responsive in Part 1. I don't exactly have any hard proof to back this up, but I went through a few shooting-centered sections of the game, switching between Remake and Remaster, and the Remake's combat just feels better every time. Maybe it's the physics of enemies reacting to kill shots or controlling your reticle being tightened up, but whatever the reason, I have way more fun shooting in Part 1 than I do in the originals. On the polar opposite side of that comment, I also noticed that clickers were way more likely to notice me in Remake versus the other releases of the game, making for a noticeable increase in challenge. In the originals, I was able to walk right up to one of these infected monsters and get right up on them with no issues, but now I've got to be much more quiet and move slower to even get near them. And on a, more admittedly ridiculous note, please someone else tell me they've noticed that clickers and Remake are smuggling Christmas hams in the back of their pants. For real, these damn fungal infection agents are walking around the post-apocalypse caked up to the damn rafters, and I gotta be honest, it's making me feel some kind of way. Moving on from the realm of burgeoning new fetishes for me though, aside from what I would call a massive improvement in the gunplay department and some minor tweaking to how dangerous clickers are, overall they left The Last of Us's gameplay alone here, which, like I said, I feel like was the right move. In situations like this, it's very easy to go in with good intentions and start making small changes. By the time you're done, we're dealing with an entirely different experience. The Last of Us was already, in my opinion, a world-class showing in terms of competent, solid gameplay and knock you on your ass emotional storytelling. Things I think are in no need of a major update. And I'm gonna level with you guys, it's actually pretty nice to have a multi-million-dollar company for once land on my side of really any debate.
Jesus!
Since this game was released, I've been getting a lot of the same question from people. Is this worth $70? And I think the answer goes back to what I said earlier. It is very hard for me to tell you what your money is worth. But for whatever good it does, I'll say for me, The Last of Us Part 1 is on par with Resident Evil in terms of a remake. A statement that those of you in the know will see as a very bold one. And listen, I understand this thing did not add as much to the base game as RE1 did, but in terms of sheer visual improvements and the overall good judgment to not fix what isn't broken, this thing deserves a damn award. Of course, that may not be the case for you, and if nothing you've heard so far in this video has changed your mind on that, so be it. Believe me, I'm not going to be offended. We're going to have different tastes sometimes. In my opinion though, a game's presentation is a massively important part of its overall experience, and when the game did things right gameplay-wise the first time around, it's the only part that really needs to be touched up as the years go by. Basically, my point is this: the less you handle any other aspect of a remake, the less likely you are to fuck that remake up. For what it's worth, as far as I'm concerned, right now, no matter how fleeting that moment may be, this is the very best looking game you can play on home console, and as such has set the standard for video game photorealism moving forward. So if you're more like me and that's sort of important to you, or you just love The Last of Us and would kill for a reason to replay it, well, consider that reason found. You know what? I'm glad I made this video. It may not be my normal type of content, and I may have suffered a bout of crippling sickness and a full-ass hard drive failure during its production, but it was great sitting down and putting together my thoughts on a game that really and truly means a lot to me. The Last of Us was a pretty big moment in my relationship with the CD world of video games. It got to me in an emotional way that previously was really only reserved for Japanese role-playing games, and I think it played a role in pushing the medium forward in terms of how much can be accomplished with this kind of storytelling. Normally in these kind of videos, I would use this end section to sort of culminate everything that I've said so far and turn it into some kind of a final thought, but really, I think I've said everything I wanted to say about this game. More than anything though, I just appreciate you guys hanging out with me while I worked my way through all of this, and let's be honest, spent way too much time rebutting arguments against the remake. Here's hoping you guys had fun with this one, and if you'd like a similar video covering the second game, feel free to let me know in the comments, because I think that'd be fun as hell. Well, I'd say I've most definitely taken up more than enough of your time for one day, so thanks again for swinging by. I hope I see all of you guys again, but until next time, I'm Jared.
Drugs. I sell hardcore drugs.
And this is Avalanche Reviews. Well, hey there. Pretty good video, right? Wait, what? The best you've ever seen on YouTube? Oh, come on, you're too kind to me. If you're looking for more stuff like this, I'll have some kind of video you're bound to get into linked on screen, and I do have a Patreon for those of you lucky enough to be able to support the content that you enjoy. Of course, there is always the YouTube membership program, which should be that little join button below the video, and if all else fails, a comment and like is always very, very much appreciated. Well, you guys are amazing, and if I could, I'd kiss all of you right on the lips. Peace out, friends. I'll see you on the next one.